Well, thank you for coming out this evening. This talk was not originally on the schedule. I hope that no one came this evening expecting to see Andrew Harvey. He was the person scheduled to give this evening's talk, as well as the workshop on Saturday. And we were very excited when we had scheduled him. Unfortunately, due to whatever circumstances, he had to cancel on short notice after we had already printed our program brochures, where you may have seen that program advertised. And on short call, it's always difficult to get a stand-in. And being the director of public programs, I have to make sure that the programs go on rain, snow, sun, wind, blizzard, or whatever. And I rose up to the occasion and volunteered to give this talk. And at short notice, I said that I would talk on the ox herding pictures of the Zen tradition, not because I am an expert on Zen Buddhism, but I did get some inspiration from those pictures. There are a variety of them, and you can check on Google, the source of all knowledge, where you'll find various presentations and representations of those pictures. Sometimes it's 10 of them, sometimes 8, and with accompanying commentary, poems, and a variety of other things. They are just a skillful means to try and indicate or represent through imagery what the spiritual path to enlightenment consists of. Though I am not a Zen Buddhist, nor was I trained in Zen Buddhism, but I feel a keen affinity for the word Zen. Not because it's Japanese, but because of its meaning. The word Zen, as we pronounce it, is a Japanese word, the vernacular of the Chinese character. The Chinese character is the same in China and in Japan. In Chinese, it's Chan. And that word, Chan, in the Chinese tradition, was the word used to indicate a word that the Buddha used. And the word that the Buddha used was jhana in Pali, which is what people think the Buddha may have spoken. And that many, many years ago, 2,500 years ago, in the Ganges Valley, Magadhan dialect, I think they referred to it. It was just a spoken language. It had no written form. Sanskrit, of course, has an alphabet and has a written form, and it's the classical language. And in Sanskrit, this word was rendered as dhyana. And but in the Pali vernacular, it was pronounced chana or jhana. And jhana, when it went to China, through Tibet, and where it became Chan. And Chan, when the Japanese read it, is Zen. And, and so it gets rather confusing. But jhana, or this word that the Buddha used, whatever it sounded like, represented a very critical aspect of his teaching. And I think when in China they started the Chan school of Buddhism, the intention was to distinguish that form of Buddhism from the scholarly tradition which had preceded it or coexisted with it. The scholarly tradition which was primarily preoccupied with studying the scriptures and teaching the scriptures so that others could study it, and then they get to teach it. And so the cycle goes on. Now, these scholarly forms of Buddhism exist in every tradition. For instance, I myself trained in Thailand, as Christine indicated. My teacher was Venerable Ajahn Chah, one of the foremost meditation masters of the last century there. Not the only one, but one of them. And in Thailand, when I was there, which was in the 1970s, 80s, and on, they used to say that there were 200,000 Buddhist monks in Thailand, which is not surprising because it's a very large Buddhist country. And everywhere you go, you would see Buddhist monasteries, Buddhist temples, and Buddhist monks. And I mean literally everywhere, in every village, every town, every city. 97% of the population in Thailand are Buddhist. And so this Buddhism is a very prevalent tradition in Thailand. Now, of those 200,000 monks, the vast majority, and I dare not say what percentage, but the vast majority are preoccupied with one or two things. One is just the ceremonial or the ritual tradition of being the monk, like a priest of the village or the town, and performing the rituals and rites and ceremonies for births and blessings and funerals and occasionally fortune-telling, which is quite prevalent too. It's kind of ceremonial. They're not necessarily extremely well educated, especially in the villages, but they have a role in society. In the towns and cities, a large portion of the monastic order is devoted to study. So there are many colleges or universities for monks where they study and they get credentials according to the level of study in which they have attained. And they primarily study the Pali language, maybe Sanskrit. They will study the texts, the scriptures, the commentaries, and they become scholars. They're like professors. And they get degrees in study. So they are scholarly monks. They are the vast majority of monks in Thailand. And only a very small fraction of the monastics are engaged in practice. And when I say practice here, I mean that which pertains to the training of the mind in accordance with the Eightfold Path, in particular the factors of right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, which we loosely term in the English vernacular as meditation these days. And so only a small percentage of monks in Thailand have much grounding or put much time and effort into this direct training of the mind through meditation. And the goal of this training of the mind is to cultivate effort, mindfulness, concentration. And concentration, the Buddha defined as the right concentration of the Eightfold Path, the Buddha defined as the four jhanas, or these four absorption, very high states of concentration, very deep states of concentration, very refined states of concentration, very blissful, refined states of mind, very pure states of mind, whatever you want to say. But so jhana means concentration, this pure form of concentration. So the jhana school would be like the practicing monks the practicing monks belong to the jhana school, not because they've necessarily attained it as yet, but because they are devoting a great portion of their effort and time and the emphasis in their monastic life to training the mind to approach and move towards this state of concentration, which is the doorway to insight. So in China, I suspect that it was very similar to what it is these days in Thailand. Most monks were scholars who traveled far and wide to gather knowledge and accumulate it and then transmit it to others, and thus we all feel very knowledgeable. But knowledge is not what the Buddha was interested in. Knowledge is something you learn and then you forget. Something that is not useless, it's useful, can be useful if it's used. And the knowledge that the Buddha wanted us to have was the knowledge of how to train to attain liberation. And the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and the proof of the value of this knowledge is in following it, in applying it. And so the Chan school of Buddhism, and then the Zen, has this strong emphasis on practice, and in particular the practice of meditation. And this was also true in Thailand. When I went there, as I said, monks everywhere, monasteries everywhere. But when I got interested, it was because I was interested in meditation. And I had to really, it was the monasteries that I'd seen while I was traveling were not monasteries where I would practice meditation. So I sought out a meditation teacher. And this is Ajahn Chah or other forest tradition monks who live outside of the system of the towns and the cities and scholarship, and have devoted many years of their lives to actually practicing meditation and cultivating the path that the Buddha laid out. Not just learning about it, but actually doing it. And so there is this tradition still quite dynamic and alive in Thailand today, as it was then, of many of these practice centers, practice monasteries. And they actually call them like practice monasteries. There's like the Samadhi school, if you wish, of Buddhism. Monks who are devoted to the practice of meditation. So though I am not a Zen Buddhist, and I was never a Zen monk, I devoted a great portion of my monastic life, my whole interest, my whole affinity with that tradition was in this context of practice, to really see the value of this teaching through the application of it. And so, this when we talk about the ox herding pictures, they are a symbolic representation of what this training is like, what this path is like when you start doing the actual practice of cultivating the mind. This is what meditation is, the bringing into being of something that is beneficial and beautiful. And so in the ox herding pictures, they often begin, and these pictures, if you see them, they're drawn in the classical form, or in the Chinese classical form, and there's this little man in the first picture, and he's looking around. Now, personally, I think that is a mistake. And of course, who are what would they know? Those people, I think. No, this is a commentary on the ox herding pictures. This is a reflection on the symbolism that I think represents this process of self-transformation and then self-transcendence. So I don't think that the first picture should be the picture of the ox herder or the man in this photo by himself, because I don't think that's where it begins. that ox-herding picture of the man represents a certain degree of self-awareness, because one is seeking for something. The ox-herding, this is the man in this picture represents the self-awareness that is questioning and seeking, wanting to know and discover. Now that is actually the start of the spiritual path. It is true. That is the start, that is the seeker. That is the spark of the seeker in every one of us. And I do believe that it is definitely in everyone who's come here this evening. But the vast majority of humanity and living beings are not seeking like that. I think the first picture should be the picture of the ox. Myself, just the ox, the wild ox. Because the wild ox represents the completely untrained, undisciplined being, completely at the under the power of instinct and habit and conditioning, and very little choice in what they do and the direction they choose or the direction they go in life. So this is, this is existence. So when there comes to the stage where there is actually a spark of self-awareness, that one is starting to question, why am I doing this? Why am I seeking so much for pleasure, and why is life the way it is, and why is there birth and suffering and old age, and I'm starting to actually question the meaning of life and looking for some deep answers. This is a degree of self-awareness, a spark of seeking that has arisen. Before that, many people still do, and many of us did, were asleep, where we were very much solely preoccupied with self-gratification and self-preservation and getting what we do. Completely reactive, living completely reactive life, identifying so completely with our conditioning, with our beliefs, with our preferences, with our likes, our dislikes, our loves, our hates, completely justified in this identification that we never questioned them. And there are many people like that still. Just so identify so strongly with their conditioning, the rigidity of it. And their lives are just, pretty much driven by this conditioning with very little self-reflection, very little capacity to question, to try and, is this really a good way? Is this the right way? Why am I doing this? And what's the consequence of this? And just starting to question. So the wild ox is the mind, the Buddha said, is like the uninstructed individual who has not come into contact with wise teachings, as yet not knowing, as yet unaware of, completely unaware of any of the spiritual aspirations, spiritual potential, spiritual qualities, virtues, and higher capacities of the human being. So that's the ox. It's not, there's only a representation. I'm sure that most oxes are pretty reasonable. They're just oxes. They live according to their nature, that's all. They can't be much different. But then, as human beings, we have this capacity for self-awareness. So in all of us, at one point or another, there arises this spark of questioning. Why? Why am I not happy? How can I be happy? Why is this happening? Why is life like this? And so this is then an opportunity if we are pointed in the right direction. And many of us are blessed with having been given a good pointing. So the pointing usually comes from spiritual teachings of various traditions and in various forms. In Buddhism, it comes in the form of having heard, say, some of the basic teachings of the Buddha pertaining to the Eightfold Path. And in particular, where the Buddha says that the mind is the source of all things, and that if we want to arrive at true understanding, we have to turn our attention inwards and look at the inner world rather than looking at the outer world. And when this realization occurs to someone, you will be very interested in introspection. I spent my years as a student in college acquiring vast sums. That actually wasn't very much, just enough to get a degree. But it was all memorizing. I just had to memorize. I studied chemistry, applied chemistry, inorganic chemistry, organic chemistry, physical chemistry, analytical chemistry, and it's all memorizing. Just vast quantities of formulas and and I memorized it, and I got my degree, so I'm a chemist. And I thought, okay. But I wasn't happy. I didn't feel that I really understood very much about life, or certainly about myself. So then I went traveling, and I experienced such a variety of things in my travels through Asia, the different cultures, the different religions, the different people that I met and lived with, and it was fascinating. And it opens your mind to the variety that's out there beyond our own little world. And yet, so I learned a lot about all these outside things, and I still didn't feel that I understood anything that was really of essence. And that's when I made a great shift. If I spend all this time looking for understanding, insight, meaning, by looking out there or by acquiring knowledge out there, when I heard that the Buddha say you have to look inside and look deeply, that really resonated with me, and I became very interested in meditation. And that's why I became a Buddhist monk, to practice introspection, meditation. And this starts the process of looking in to see what's going on, what's happening as we experience it subjectively, the world within, the world of our emotions and thoughts and feelings, if you wish, the mind. And this is setting up a duality, which is the only way you can talk. So there's the seeker, the knowing, the self-awareness, and then there's observing the mind, which is also, it's all mind, but the knowing, the self-awareness is observing what the mind is doing. And you start to get some glimpses of how the mind behaves and where these emotions come from. And it's like, in the ox herding pictures, it's the picture of the little guy. He's been looking and he's seeing some footprints of the ox, and maybe there is something there. And then the next picture, you see the little guy, and he actually catches a glimpse of the tail of the ox. He's starting through this process of self-awareness, turning the attention back in, begins to observe aspects of how the mind is operating, aspects of this internal world. And it's difficult to do that, actually. It's difficult to become proficient in that. The mind is very slippery, and every time you try to look inwards, you get lost. What you get lost in the old habits of looking out, of getting caught in identifying with the thoughts and the feelings and the emotions and the distractions And so the little guy, instead of going after the ox, goes back to watch TV. He didn't have TV in those days. He probably watched some Chinese opera. But then eventually, he remembers and he comes, where is that ox? What's he up to? And, this builds up momentum. And so that maybe he starts to really devote some time to try to, how can I get hold of this ox a little better? And this is when meditation practice in the form of some type of technique or method of training is very valuable. And so these techniques of meditation, be they some things like mindfulness of breathing, or a mantra meditation, or visualization, something to anchor and try to hold this self-awareness so that it can actually begin to reflect the activity of the mind more clearly, so that ox actually is visible, and what the ox is doing is more visible more constantly. And it's unruly and it's wild. And so it takes a lot of patience. Now, even as the ox herder has come to this point and has sufficient self-awareness and introspection that he's aware of this jungle that this ox is roaming in, the wildness of it, he's got to tame it. Got to get a hold of it. And so in the next picture, it shows you, and there's varieties of them. One of them, he grabs the ox by the horn and he tries to wrestle it. And another one, he ties it with a rope around the neck and pulls it, and it's a tug of war. And this is the stage in practice, specifically, say, in meditation practice, when you really undertake a formal training of meditation and systematically try to apply your attention to an object of meditation in order to not only train the mind to remain attentive and focused, but also to notice how unattentive and unfocused it is and unruly it is. So the rope that you tie the mind with represents mindfulness and effort. So the knowing, the self-awareness, makes the effort to discipline the unruly ox, to teach it to be more still, more calm, more peaceful, to become, a little more, a little less wild and a little more civilized, if you wish, so that the ox can be a very good friend, especially to a farmer. But a wild ox is a pretty dangerous creature. Wild and untrained minds can bring great misery to oneself and the world. And this has been proven over and over again. Foolishness brings suffering far and wide. And, there is nothing that can be as harmful to you as an untrained mind. That's from the Buddha himself. And there is nothing that can be of greater benefit to us than a trained mind. And so this wild ox, unruly, can be trained. It requires patience and effort in balance. Not just desire, not just wanting, not just willpower. It's a skill that comes from repetition, from doing it on a regular basis with the right guidance. The mind can be trained. If the mind could not be trained, we would all still be wild, like the wild buffaloes. But the Buddha proved that the wild mind can be trained and can be liberated. So, and this has been proven over and over through the centuries by the various spiritual teachers and masters who have arisen and are given life to this process. So this training of the mind, patient, gentle effort, over and over, to try and overcome the unruliness, be it restlessness, agitation, be it doubt, be it this preoccupation with chasing after the past or the future, be it just dullness and laziness, all the things that the mind, bad habits, if you wish, bad habits of the mind, we have to work through them with patient, gentle effort, gradually teaching the mind, guiding the mind, helping the mind to get beyond its unruly nature and begin to experience the benefit of being calm, peaceful, still, rather than wild. And so the ox herding picture is the man who's got the ox and he's fighting it back and forth, and it takes time. This may take years. It may take many years. And it's not, just progress all the time. You make progress and and then maybe there's a regression. It's a conditioned thing. So you may make progress. Some meditations are very good. It can deteriorate because it's a conditioned state. Your meditation is still at a level where it can go up and down. But over time and with practice, with patience, with diligence, with commitment, with time, very important, with time, both the time in length of spaced out days and months, but also time in the time that you actually do the practice. This will help us develop a skill by which we can gradually bring the mind to states of greater calmness, greater peace. And those states are no longer a struggle. At first it is a struggle when you get hold of the bull by the horns and when you start meditating. It's a struggle. The mind, it doesn't like it. It wants to run. It wants to go back into the wilderness and roam around. And you're trying to train it. So it's resistant. Why? It doesn't know any better. That's why. It doesn't know any better. But we can gradually educate it, teach it, and it becomes gradually willing to notice, wow, this is nice. This is kind of nice to just be resting here instead of running around and dust in my nostrils and dust in my eyes and fending off all those wild animals. Here, this is kind of in the shade, I'm protected, it's so nice, I don't have to pull anything, I don't have to push anything, I can just rest. Wow, this is really nice here. So that's when the meditation starts to become pleasant. The mind is not fighting so much and it's starting to settle down. And you find that in the ox herding pictures, it shows the man now just sitting on the ox and riding it, playing a flute. And the ox is just walking along. And so this is a stage in meditation which is a pleasant meditation. It's like if we're doing mindfulness of breathing. When we start mindfulness of breathing, most people, they kind of put attention on the breath, and before they count to 3 breaths, the mind's already gone somewhere else, and then they remember and bring it back, and then it goes away and bring it back, and so that's a tug of war. But then you come to gradually the thinning out of the jungle of thoughts, and the restlessness settles down, and you begin to really enjoy being with the breath and experiencing the whole breath. And it's just a really restful state where the mind and the knowing, the awareness, is together and enjoying this experience. And this is like riding on the back of the ox and playing your flute. It's a pleasant meditation, approaching And there, of course, when we talk about a pleasant meditation, it's a tremendous spectrum that can go into very refined states of bliss and joy and deep calmness, deep serenity. You're no longer distracted by thoughts, a few thoughts, maybe very occasionally. The noises and things, even the body's kind of falling into, things are falling away. And the mind is just collecting and resting with the experience of the meditation object, or the breathing in this case. And it's enjoyable, it's restful, it's peaceful, there's clarity, and there is this sense of unity. You're feeling like there's no longer such a big separation with the ox and the knowing. And now, you're kind of together, close together. And the breathing becomes even more refined, increasingly more refined, increasingly more refined. The knowing is sharp, and this meditation gets deeper and deeper and more peaceful, more peaceful. And following this, according to the masters, the meditation can go sufficiently deep that the world of the senses shuts down. The mind completely withdraws. The withdrawing of the mind is not, it's just a letting go, turning away from and turning towards the core, the essence of the experience of joy. And the Buddha said that the basic nature of the mind is radiance, luminosity, radiance of the mind. And this radiance of the mind is manifest when the disturbances in it are removed. Now, as we become increasingly more peaceful, increasingly more still, increasingly more silent, increasingly more engaged in this experience of the moment, the waves and the disturbances in the mind have flattened out. There is a tremendous stillness and silence and joy and bliss. And most meditators of all traditions, where they go, they talk about the perception of light. And they describe it in various terms. And some people who are not meditators also experience this. In near-death experiences, often people talk about a brilliant light. This is just the pure, if you wish, just the pure consciousness, or the unadulterated. So the Buddha called this the radiant, the original radiance of the mind. He did not call it the pure mind, though. He called it the radiant mind. So the radiant mind is, if you wish, the original mind, but it's still a conditioned mind. And this is a big, there may be disagreements from different traditions, but anyway, common experience of deep meditation is the perception of brilliant light. This is the radiant mind. If one experiences this and can cultivate this attention, this engagement, this willingness to be even more still and enjoy this. This is the doorway that leads to what the Buddha called jhana. Okay, we come back to jhana, to absorption, deep meditation. And in deep meditation, this depth of meditation, the duality of the knower and the known ceases. And so in the ox herding pictures, they will show the little picture, the little round picture of the little guy, little ox herder sitting there, but there is no ox. And the ox herder is sitting there, like gazing into the distance, and there is this like a moon in the background, or in the distance, like a moon. And so this is the experience symbolically of this state of meditation when one goes into a deep absorption where the brilliance of the mind is just, it's awesome. It's awesome. It's all there is, and there is the knowing of it. There is no longer the duality of doing. The ox is gone. There is just the knowing, the radiance. The knowing and radiance. So there is this, and it is, the Buddha said, it's kind of an extraordinary experience. It's a beautiful, blissful, it's a spiritual experience. Because for the first time, this frees the individual from the burden of the sensory world and frees one from the burden of doing and allows one to actually see the just being and how blissful that is. So this is a tremendous state of meditation. But in Buddhism, this was not the end. And so in the ox herding pictures, it's not the last picture. But many meditators get stuck there. It's so beautiful, it's so radiant, it's so blissful, it's so magnificent. Why would anybody seek for anything more? And so without the guidance of a master or somebody who has trod the path before, one can be stuck contented with that experience and be able to master that experience so one can attain that more easily, more frequently, spend time. It's a timeless zone. It's a blissful, timeless zone. And it's great, but it's not enlightenment. It's still a conditioned state. It can deteriorate. One can lose it if one doesn't maintain it. Just like all the money you've got. You've saved it and it's nice, but you can lose it. Everything that's conditioned can be lost. So this too, one's meditation can deteriorate. But it's a blissful state. Now, it's important to have the guidance of a teacher to really help one get beyond that, to really penetrate beyond that. And what is there beyond that? It requires that the awareness and the discernment, for a start, questions that, is this the end? Because it's so awesome, so brilliant, you just assume it's the end. But is this the end? Meaning, is it permanent? Is it stable? Does it require maintaining? If it's not permanent and it's not stable and it requires maintaining, it can't be the end. And so with discernment, one's practice has to continue. But these are very refined levels. But with practice, one's discernment will investigate and see that even this most beautiful, extraordinarily brilliant radiance of mind is still impermanent. And incredibly, there's one of the meditation masters whom I met on a number of occasions and lived with just for a few days. I visit his monastery. Was Venerable Acharya Mahabua, or Ajahn Mahabua. He's a contemporary of Ajahn Chah. They're about the same age. They were disciples of the same teacher. He's a very fierce teacher, Ajahn Mahabua. Very fierce. His practice, it's extraordinary when you read his biography, and his teachings are very, very powerful. But this is what he says about this. Maybe I should read it, if I can find it quickly. What he says about this radiance. This radiance of mind. Because we always, when we say, the Buddha said this original mind is radiant. And most people will hear that and think, oh, that's a pure mind. But it's only pure in the sense of it doesn't have defilements obstructing the radiance. It's not pure in essence. The original mind means the original mind of the round in which the mind finds itself spinning around and about. As in the Buddha's saying, monks, the original mind is radiant. Notice that. But because of the mixture of defilements, or because of the defilements which come passing through, it becomes darkened. The original mind here refers to the origin of conventional realities, not to the origin of purity. The Buddha said radiant, not pure. So this original mind it just means that it's a very refined state of consciousness. It's not the end. But when you experience it and the mind is gathered to this point, becoming a radiance within the mind, and this radiance, even the tools of super mindfulness and super discernment will have to fall for it. When they first meet it, it's so beautiful. It's something we have never seen before, never met before. From the beginning of our practice or from the day of our birth, we thus become awed and amazed. It seems for the moment that nothing can compare to its magnificence. And why shouldn't it be magnificent? It has been the king of the round of birth and death in all the realms since a beginningless time, since way back when, for countless eons. So this radiant mind, Ajahn Mahabua says, here is where you will find and discover the ultimate ignorance or unawareness. In this radiance, he had a really, I probably can't find it now, but he had a really thing where, when we talk about ignorance, often people, we conjure up that ignorance is something nasty and ugly and, threatening. And he said, no, this is the ultimate ignorance. It's the most beautiful thing. It's the Miss Universe of ever. It's the most radiant, beautiful. This is where the ultimate ignorance hides, at this point, in this radiance of mind. And so he says that one has to investigate beyond. Once we have investigated it, this radiance, with sharp discernment, until we know it clearly, this phenomenon will dissolve away in a completely unexpected way. At the same time, you could call it awakening, or closing down the cemeteries of the round of rebirths, the round of the mind. And once this phenomenon has dissolved away, something even more amazing, which has been concealed by the unawareness, will be revealed in all its fullness. And this, he says, is beyond convention, beyond terminology, beyond concept. And this he calls the pure mind. Now that is a very questionable thing, but it's beyond conception, beyond convention. This is what is said to be like the quaking of the cosmos within the heart. This is a very crucial mental moment when the heart breaks away from convention. This moment when release and conventional reality break away from each other. From that moment on, there is no more problems. So in the Oxford pictures, bringing it back to this, we left off at the little guy sitting there, peacefully enjoying the scene and the moon. Complete stillness and silence and bliss. Wonderful. But then there's another one. And the next one is just the circle, which is completely empty. Not only is there no doing, no ox, there is no body there. Nobody, no one there. It's a complete emptiness. Shunyata, complete emptiness. Emptiness of duality, emptiness of concept, emptiness of identification, emptiness of all conventions, that which is transcendent. So, that is awakening, that is enlightenment, that is the realization of the Buddha and other awakened ones. Now, when this realization, then what that's like touching reality is in the Oxford pictures. The next one is a picture where instead of just the emptiness, now we have a very beautiful nature scene in a Chinese style. A touching of reality, the way things really are. And the way things really are, that there is conventional reality and there's that transcendental, if you wish, or that which is beyond. Conventional reality has its use and one uses it accordingly. It's real and it's in the conventional sense. It applies in the conventional sense. And so Ajahn Mahabua says, as far as the mind and body, these are just conditions. They have no capacity. They are no longer capable of affecting or provoking the mind. It's a strange way of speaking. The mind and body processes will continue. They cause no problem anymore. There is no problem. The same with the world. The sight, sound, smells, taste, and tactile sensation. Each has its separate reality. To each one we say, it exists, if it exists. If not, no matter. The only problem has been the mind which makes labels and assumptions through its own stupidity. Once it gains enough intelligence, it becomes real. All phenomena within and without are real. Each has its own separate reality, with no more of the conflicts or issues which used to occur. Then in the Oxford pictures, there is one last one, and this shows this picture of now no longer the little guy. He's no longer a little guy, no longer the tiny little skinny Oxforder. Now he's become a kind of jolly, chubby fellow. He's a jolly, chubby fellow, and well endowed with girth, and he carries a kind of a stick with a bundle on his back, and walking around, and he's, and there are children, and there's, the benevolent sage. And so this is what happens then. What do you do then? And so when we reach the stage where each has its own separate reality, we can say that the war between the mind and defilements is over. When the time comes to part, we part. If not, we live together, like everyone else in the world. But we don't take issue with each other like everyone else in the world. We make no wars with ourselves or with others. And this is the sage. They are not at war with themselves. They are peaceful. They are not at war with the world. They are peaceful because they have realized the true nature, this reality that has freed the mind from its, as Ajahn Mahabua said, stupidity, all greed, hatred, and delusion. And this is, the greatest blessing that can be given to the world is to become enlightened. When an individual becomes enlightened, the whole world benefits. Every blade of grass they say. But it is true. And enlightened beings are not all the same in exactly how they live. My teacher, Venerable Ajahn Chah, he had his personality and his character. Ajahn Mahabua had his personality and character, quite different. One is kind of kind of like a Marine sergeant, he ran his monastery he was fierce, he was scary. Ajahn Chah was like, kind of chubby, friendly, jovial teacher. And of the monks that I've met, very different personalities, the way they present, but they share a unique quality. They are at peace with themselves, and they are at peace with the world. And this is the ox herding pictures. If you'd like to find them, go to the source of all knowledge, and you will find them. Now, when you look at them, and if you read the commentaries, you will find that the commentaries are not in accordance with what I have shared with you this evening. Do not be misled by anybody. These are pictures. I interpret them in a way that is relevant to me, in accordance with my practice and my experience. And this is not to diminish any other commentary or explanation. These are just symbols, and we use a symbol to weave a story, and the story should resonate with something that we have experienced or are experiencing. And if it does, then it has power. It's useful, it's meaningful. So I offer this, let's say, a reflection on the ox herding pictures and how they illustrate this path of practice with its emphasis on introspection, with its importance on meditation and the training of the mind, and with the vistas that are possible if we are able to make headway in this training. So thank you very much for being so attentive.
Okay, we have a question from online. Is the ultimate attainment of a quiet mind a state of being or a state of non-being?
Well, the ultimate attainment of a quiet mind is just a quiet mind, but a quiet mind can be not very refined, but there are various degrees of this. But from the tone of the question, I suspect that they would mean like what Ajahn Mahabua calls the pure mind, or that which transcends, the enlightened mind. Is that a state of being or non-being? Those terms cannot apply to it. By its very nature, it is beyond convention, beyond conception, beyond any categorizing, anything. You can't say anything. As soon as you say it, you've put it into a concept or a limitation. To this end, it is I'm not trying to be just, it's not like I'm trying to avoid the question. To be honest, it's not. One is I don't know exactly what it is because I'm not enlightened. But two, it is not knowable by people who are not enlightened. And I think when people who are not enlightened discourse on it, it does a disservice to it. But, we'd like to talk about it. Now, there is a lot of controversy. Notice my American controversy. I didn't say controversy. I've been practicing. There is a lot of controversy even within the Buddhist schools. And certainly, Ajahn Mahabua here, you know, he does teach in a way which is extremely explicit when he talks about this pure mind. And it almost, you know, it kind of almost sounds that it's contradicting some of teachings of other Buddhist masters. We had here not long ago Venerable Ajahn Brahmavamsa, who's a good friend of mine and a very accomplished meditator. He greatly disagrees with Ajahn Mahabur on this one thing because we're putting a name to something. The pure, or say the liberated mind, or the way the Buddha spoke of it was never in terms of in any being or non-being, in any conceptual term. In describing it, he just said that it was liberated from greed, hatred, and delusion. Liberated from all convention, liberated from, well, you say, well, what is it? Well, if you've got, if you take away all conditions and all conventions and all concepts and all existence and whatever is left, that's it. It is not something you can point to. So either the unconditioned, you know, the Buddha did speak about the conditioned and the unconditioned, but the unconditioned is nothing, you know, it's just stands in contrast to the condition. That's all. The condition is unsatisfactory. We don't belong there. Doesn't mean we have to. Doesn't mean we go somewhere else. Wherever you go, you're going to be there. So there's always a problem.
Well, I guess mine are less ethereal than some, but...
Thank goodness.
And I guess what my first comment is your last statement. I'm not sure, you know, aren't we supposed to be here? Where I thought we go nowhere by mistake. I mean, my faith teaches me that, you know, that this is where we're supposed to be. So I'm not quite sure what you meant by the last statement. But my question is just how does a monk really support themselves? So you were a chemist, and then you did this. So, I mean, I'd love to take my problem of I've got 5 kids and I have a very demanding job, and you know, I always say when I go to my back porch, I'll just sit on this, I'll just start this meditation, and I've got Thich Nhat Hanh. I love that stuff I used to listen to, and I had cancer survivor, but I had got a year to live, but everything worked, so now I'm still here, and it's great. But I got away from that, so that time when you feel, you know, when you're in the grips of it, somehow I could embrace it much more. Of course, I couldn't work at that point, so that made it easier. So anyway, how do you do that in the real world? How did you do it?
Well, this is the real world, meaning the world in which we find ourselves. It's, for a start, the question of, you know, this, we should be here or shouldn't be here. We, you know, this is where we are now. So we always start with the present moment. This is where we are. When I say we don't belong here, it's more like, what I mean by that is the conditioned realm, existence, is never going to provide what we're seeking for, which is happiness or fulfillment. So that's why, I mean, I say these things within this context. The conditioned realm, the realm of birth and death, the realm of existence, is always going to be flawed. That's its nature. The existence implies birth and death. And there's just no way around it. Although we can make up, you know, we can make up all sorts of stories, like in the movies. So we make up the story about heaven being permanently happy and not changing. So we feel good about that. But is it real, is the question. And now, I'm not here to deny anybody's belief, but in the Buddhist teachings, it's not, because in the cosmology in Buddhism, every realm, existence implies impermanence. Birth, where there is birth, there will be death. That's existence. where there is an arising, there will be a cessation. That is just the nature, the existence. There is no, in Buddhism, there is no realm where there is an arising of and it's stable. It's conditioned. The arising is conditioned, therefore it changes, it ceases. So the conditioned realm, existence in the Buddhist understanding is flawed. And that's why when I say we don't belong there, it's like we're not going to find what we want in this, in existence. But this is exactly where we should be now, because this is where we are. And so we work from this point with trying to arrive at better understanding. How can we get, I mean, how can I find fulfillment and completion? So that's the spiritual quest now. And we're going to look for it, and we're going to seek with a mind that's inquiring, and we're going to train the mind so it can look more deeply, penetrate more deeply. So with regards the lay life, the Buddha, he was very clear on it. The lay life, we're encumbered, we're burdened with a lot of responsibilities, obligations, and distractions, and it takes up a lot of time and a lot of energy, so that we are preoccupied with many worldly, not bad, it is not bad, worldly, preoccupied with maybe very important things of the world. Family, children, jobs, career, society, environment. It's very busy, and it keeps the mind very preoccupied. So the Buddha said, this is like a cluttered life, cluttered, and it's a cluttered mind. And it is difficult to extricate oneself from the outer clutter, and it's even more difficult to to remove oneself, or to separate oneself, or to free oneself from the inner clutter while in the midst of so much outer clutter. And so the Buddha does, the path is for kaya viveka, to withdraw physically to some degree, as much as possible, from the distraction and the complexity and the preoccupations of the world. Some people can do this to a greater degree than others. For instance, I, at the age of 24, did not have 5 children. And I didn't think very much about my retirement either. And I thought, so then I met this teacher, I was inspired, I want to meditate. And he said, well, if you want to be my disciple, you have to train for 5 years. Well, 5 years? It's a lifetime. And so I said, no. And I went and stayed in another monastery where the teacher wasn't as strict about it. So I just meditated there for 3 months. And during those 3 months, I was meditating diligently, and I was just, this is hard. This is really hard. And if I spend 5 years getting a degree in chemistry, maybe it does take 5 years to try and unravel and kind of cultivate the mind. So I was willing to renounce a lot of my freedom and my possessions, and I chose to become a homeless, penniless monk, living off the alms of the lay supporters who supported the monks in the monastery, and went and lived in the monastery. I had 3 robes. I ate whatever I was given once a day. I slept out if necessary, or in a shed if necessary. And the training was be content with little, talk little, eat little, sleep little, meditate a lot. Your needs are, food, you get 1 meal a day. Whatever you're given. It's not what you like. Whatever you're given. Once a day. Clothing, you got your robes. 3 robes, that's enough. You got a bowl, you got an alms bowl. That's enough. You got a razor. You're allowed to have a razor because you've got to shave your head. You need a sewing kit to mend your robes. Water strainer to strain water. Really basic. It is possible, right? It's an extreme. The monastic life is an alternative, and it is an extreme, but it's a designed extreme to streamline your life so much that you have the least number of preoccupations other than meditation. You give up a lot of freedoms. You do. You give up a lot of independence. You become completely dependent on others, what they will give you. And in exchange, you're relieved of a lot of responsibilities. So it's a fair exchange. People say, well, what about if everybody became a monk? This hasn't happened yet. Why? Because it's not easy. Actually, it's not. It's really hard being a monk. Until you really develop some spiritual, qualities. It is a difficult life. It's a life of renunciation. It's not the life that the vast majority of people will choose to live, but it is available for those who so aspire. On a more ordinary level in our own lives, we've all can make choices to either simplify to some extent or to make life more complicated. There's a trade-off in everything. And so we can reflect and consider our priorities in life. Sometimes we can choose, sometimes we can't. Some things you just can't choose. It's already the conditions, the choices that you made then are now created this condition. You make the best of it at this time. But there are always some choices we can make. Like, I really encourage people these days, meditation is great, but simplicity is a great help, simplifying simplicity. Because this life in modern times has become so fast and so complicated, so overwhelming. It's like a torrent. It's a current that can just sweep us away, and we lose ourselves. So whatever you can do to simplify and give yourself a little more space, a little more time, a little more opportunity for some calmness and introspection. We may do what we can.
If it's not too indiscreet, can I ask you why, after choosing the monastic life that apparently gave you a lot of satisfaction and enlightenment, why did you come back to our complex Western world?
Very good question. This is where I confess, the confession of an ex-monk. For a start, I must correct your statement. It did not give me enlightenment. I am not enlightened.
Oh, okay.
So that is, if I was enlightened, maybe I would be still a monk. I don't know, but I am not enlightened. So that's the first and most important thing to clarify. With regards to how much joy that monastic life gave me, let me also correct that. The first 5 years of my monastic life were extraordinarily hard, unpleasant, painful, struggle for survival, okay? It's like you're reborn. Here I was, 24 years old. I'm in Thailand, living in the jungles. Can't speak the language, eating this food that's and it's all thrown in your bowl by hundreds of people. And I had, and all I was doing is struggling for survival. I was struggling with just enduring the hardship of that life in the jungle, with all sorts of sickness. I had malaria for 2 years. I had dysentery. I had, the jungles are full of things. Typhoid and typhus, and the list goes on. And they're the big ones. The little ones are things like you get, all these skin rashes, athlete's foot that never goes away, and you get, you don't think much of it, but you get teeth that, develop cavities, and you get teeth that you get bitten by scorpions and ticks and fleas, and you're living with, it's no fun at all, I tell you. But so why do you do it? Because you are so inspired by the aspiration. And the teaching is, it's a training. You're struggling with the ox. You expect it to be a hug and kiss? Oh, that's a little cuddly hug and kiss with a wild ox. I mean, the training, the way it's presented, is that you have to develop endurance, patience. You have to put up with a lot of, you have to build up your energy, your stamina, your ability to endure. And, in all of that, you're trying to cultivate these qualities in the mind. So, it wasn't pleasant. It was actually very hard. But I was inspired by my teacher. I was inspired by that possibility, and I practiced as diligently as I could. After 5 years, I gradually, things got easier because I could speak the language. So, I didn't feel so isolated. I felt, comfortable in the robes, and I knew the customs, and I knew felt comfortable as a monk. It's like, you're reborn. It's a completely different life. I mean, you have to learn to walk, you have to learn to talk, everything is different. You have to learn to eat in a different way. So after 5 years, physically I felt better. And I was, my teacher sent me to a monastery where I got proper medical treatment, and I finally got cured of my malaria and dysentery, and started to gain some weight again, and felt a bit, started to be able to cope with that environment, and I felt quite good. And I practiced, and I continued to practice. And I was very successful. In my practice, it did improve. But what happened was that because I was doing so, my responsibilities grew beyond my abilities. And eventually, I found myself, after 23 years, that I'd been in charge of a monastery in Thailand, but my teacher was there. And I felt, even though we lived in separate monasteries, I derived a lot of confidence and strength from him. When I went to Australia, where he sent me to establish a monastery, I felt quite isolated from that support. And he was very sick then. He got very, very sick and stopped teaching. So he was no longer available. But, it was like my responsibilities grew as the monastery grew and the community grew, and I felt by the end of that that I felt quite burdened by my responsibilities, and to be honest, spiritually inadequate. my practice had not progressed, mainly because of all the responsibilities I'd taken on, or was asked to take on. I don't know which. It's not like you're forced to take it. It's you agree to take it on. And you spend so much of your time in administration and talking and communicating with monks and lay people and running organizations. It leaves less time for spiritual growth. And so I found that to be, for me, unacceptable. And so eventually I resigned and left. And once I left, I decided that I'd done as much as I was going to do this time around as a monk.
I have a question going around in my head. I hope I can phrase it. It's about the enlightened mind. So the mind, by definition, is a condition or a construct because it's limited, correct?
The mind is conditioned. It is, in the Buddhist terminology, everything that is not body is mind. So it's the abstract aspect of you. That's feelings, thoughts, concepts, memory, consciousness.
Okay, so the question would be, when you get to the circle that's empty, is that even mind anymore, or is
Yes.
that still mind? That's
Yes.
not essence or spirit or universal
No.
consciousness. That's still mind.
That is the radiant mind. If you wish, the basic nature of consciousness, with no waves to distort. It's just that nature that's radiant. So it's the reflection of the, if you wish, pure in the sense of no activity, no ripples in it. So there is that's a stillness. It is a conditioned state, though, and it is still in the
Still mind.
yes.
Okay.